Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, the home theater geek. On today's episode of AVS Tech Talk, I am talking with none other than Paul Barton, founder and chief speaker designer for PSB Speakers. Hey, Paul, thanks for being on the show.
Hi, Scott. It's been a while since we've talked.
It has, but I'm so glad you're here today in particular because right about now, PSB is celebrating its 50th anniversary of selling speakers. That's quite an accomplishment. Congratulations.
Well, not just selling, making speakers.
Making, more to the point. More to the point. Let's be clear here. Yes. I mean, you're selling what you make, but
Yeah.
50 years of designing and making speakers. I mean, you put the Canadian speaker industry on the map. You yourself. It's very impressive.
Well, thank you. And yeah, the company I founded started in 1972.
Mm-hmm.
And we started in a little town just north of where I grew up, Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, a little town called St. Jacobs. And right after high school, two high school buddies and myself decided to start PSB. I'd been doing some building of loudspeakers in high school and actually had a job at a hi-fi store. And my two high school buddies decided to join forces. And the summer of 72, we set up a little shop and the three of us started making speakers.
Wow. Wow. Now, where did the name PSB come from? I assume that P is Paul,
Yeah.
B is Barton.
Yeah, the S is my wife, Sue. We're high school sweethearts.
Oh,
and,
that's nice.
Yeah. In fact, I designed the first PSB logo in a common class we were in, a geography class in high school. And, I wanted to sort of impress her, and I made it PSB Speakers.
Oh, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Well, I must say, she certainly deserved to be positioned in the logo because in the early days, of course, we were hand to mouth, and she had a full-time job and supported me or us for quite a long time before PSB started generating enough income to support us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
well, then thanks to Sue for
yeah,
supporting this fledgling enterprise, which became pretty darn big.
yeah. Well, and been here a long time.
Yeah, yeah. Now I want to start really with before PSB, and I know that you are a musician, and
Mhm.
that I think really informs all of your subsequent work in speaker design. How did you get involved in music?
Well, my father enrolled me into a string class at a very early age. In the town that we grew up, it had a very strong string program, some good teachers, and I grew up in a separate school, Catholic separate school, and they had a music program which was shared in all the schools in the community. So I became involved in that. Of course, my dad, who was a tenor, well established in the area, started the first operatic society in our area.
Mm.
And so I sort of grew up with that kind of environment. And then when my dad, oh, there's a picture of my dad building the very first full-size violin that I had.
And that's amazing. Now, as I recall, he was a woodworker, I guess, but he had never made instruments before.
No, my dad was not a woodworker.
He wasn't even a woodworker.
No, he was an industrial steel salesman. He sold the girders that are used to build bridges.
Wow.
And this was his passion, music. And, as I grew up, starting at age 6 on the violin, you use what they call a half-size violin. And then you graduate as you get older to a three-quarter size violin. And I was 11 years old, or I was actually 9 when my dad started to build the violin. It took him 2 years to make it. And originally he had purchased a violin in anticipation of that being my first full-size violin, but it turned out to be a bit of a dud. And he bought it at an auction. I don't think he paid a lot for it. And the nice thing about that purchase was that the violin case that I currently use is the case.
With the case from that first purchase?
Yeah, it was a beautiful leather case with a velvet lining, and
Oh, man.
beautiful. I still have it. And so my dad decided to build a violin. So it took him a year to make all the tools. In this picture, you'll see he's holding a caliper, which he actually made that caliper out of wood, maple.
Wow.
And in the middle of that stick he's got in his hand is a set screw that sets the depth of the caliper so he can measure the violin's plate thickness that changes within the violin.
Mm-hmm.
And so he made all the tools, he made all the scrapes, he made all the clamps to put the violin together.
That's incredible.
And then it took him a year to build the actual violin. And at the end of that year, this picture here is me in my pajamas at a very young age. This is where I practiced my violin every night before I went to bed.
Wow.
Yeah. And anyway, getting back to the violin, he finished the violin. Actually, quite an interesting story. My violin teacher had a Guarnerius violin, which is
man, that's like one of the best in the world ever.
Well, it's up there with Stradivarius, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So she had a Guarnerius violin, and I was practicing for a festival that I was going to compete in, and my dad was viciously trying to get the violin finished before I had to do the competition. And it was getting so close that my violin teacher lent me her violin.
Guarnerius?
The Guarnerius violin for me to take home on the bus to practice and get used to playing a full-size violin before my dad finished his violin.
Whoa.
And at that age, I didn't realize I was carrying around $1 million violin.
Really?
Yeah. So,
Chris, you're getting ahead of us on the pictures here.
Yeah, that's jumping a little bit ahead there.
So you could, there you go.
Yeah. So in this competition, he finished the violin on time, and in this competition, it was an open class where it's not how old you are that qualifies you. It's the repertoire that you use to play.
Mm-hmm.
So I competed against an open class, which had 15 to 20-year-olds in it.
Oh man!
And I was 11 years old, and so I played the violin in a competition for the first time, and I won the competition with the highest mark they ever awarded.
Wow!
Yeah, it was really a highlight for my launching my career and learning a lot about competition and
playing music.
Playing music and appreciating music. I remember when my dad was sort of finishing the violin, the tuning post, which is a post that goes between just under the bridge to the back of the violin, inside the violin. And by adjusting the position of that post, you can change the tone of the violin and the balance between the strings, because it's the foundation of which everything vibrates around. And so my dad and I'd sit there and I'd play it, and he'd take the violin with a special tool and go inside and move the sound post a little bit, and then I'd play. So at a very early age, I was very much attuned to listening to differences in sound and qualifying, what sounded natural and what didn't sound natural, or what didn't sound good, or that sort of thing. So, music as a background was a very strong part of my skill set, I guess.
Yeah, well, obviously, you were listening carefully to music as you were playing it, and as your dad was performing, and you were in different groups, I'm sure, playing music, which attuned you to sound, and to musical sound in particular, and which I guess then led to wanting to design speakers to reproduce that sound.
That's right. And I learned at an early age that sound reproduction, my dad used to buy these, and they were so old, they were 78s. He would buy me recordings of Fritz Kreisler, a famous violinist.
Oh, yeah.
Playing the one part of the Bach double violin concerto. So I could play either the first, on one side of the record, he played the first violin, and on the other side of the record, he played the second violin.
Oh, it was like music -1, sort of.
That's right. And so I would learn to play along as a second violin or a first violin, depending on which side of the album I used.
Mm-hmm.
And would be able to play double violin concertos
with Fritz Kreisler.
Yeah. And so I learned back then, I can remember it was a record player, just a small console with a 10-inch woofer that was electromagnetic. It didn't even have a magnet in it, and had one tube. And that's the sound reproduction system I got started in sound reproduction. And then my dad and I built a couple of speakers. I was always interested in, electronics and taking things apart to see how they worked. So he and I, because he had this little wood shop that he built to make the violin, we could make other things. And so we made a pair of speakers and bought a Rotel receiver, believe it or not, back in
Oh yeah.
And Rotel, that it goes back a long way.
And it's been a very, very venerable brand and still going strong today.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like Rotel was one of the very first in the early days of 2-channel stereo. That's when stereo was just coming out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's how
you were building speakers and mating them with a Rotel receiver. And then you went through high school and met up with your two buddies and started building speakers in your garage. Was that where the first thing was?
Because my dad had the tool shop, I could cut up. What I did was I had a job in high school, towards the end of high school, at a hi-fi store in Waterloo, near the University of Waterloo.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would build kits, and I sourced all the drivers from local vendors, including Electrohome, which was a strong manufacturer of TVs and hi-fi consoles in Kitchener-Waterloo, where I grew up. And I used to go to their service department to buy the parts for the crossovers and the coils, because they used to sell them as service parts. And so I would go there and buy quantities of these service parts to build kits, 3-way and 2-way kits that I put all the screw holes in. All you had to do was you needed a Robertson screwdriver, which is a Canadian invention, and a soldering iron.
Uh-huh.
And the university students would buy them with their AV receivers with their student loan money.
Right.
Yeah, which
forget about books or food.
Yeah, no. I won't eat for a month as long as I can get my hi-fi system.
Uh-huh.
And so, or maybe longer than that. And so, they could buy a kit and take it to their dorm and put it together, and they had a speaker. And that's really how I got started. And then my two partners got interested and joined forces. And actually, one of my partners, his dad was a carpenter, and they had a wood shop in his garage. So we sort of transported the manufacture of the panels and all that over to Klaus's father's garage. And that was before the summer of '72. And then the summer of '72, we rented a space in St. Jacobs, where we moved all of whatever limited equipment we had. I brought my dad's radio arm saw, and there was some equipment at the facility because it was being used to produce some kitchen cabinet materials. And yeah, it was sort of and actually the beginning of PSB was only about 1,000 square feet.
Wow.
And that's where we built the speakers.
Well, we're going to talk about some of the hallmark speakers that you've built over these last 50 years. Before we do, though, I want to talk a little bit about the facility where you learned and developed methods of measuring speaker performance, which is the Canadian NRC.
That's right. And what you see in this picture is a building, one of 65 buildings on the campus. It's called M37, and within that building is the Anechoic Chamber on the campus. And there's a picture of a speaker on the rotating stand in the Anechoic Chamber.
And we should mention for those who might not recognize that term, anechoic means no echo. There is no echoing. There's no reflection off of the walls. And you can see these walls are not solid, flat walls. They are deep triangles of foam that absorb virtually all sound, or most, as much as they possibly can, right?
Actually, the material that they use, the wedges that you see, the material is actually fiberglass. And it's a composition that's often referred to as rigid duct liner. You've seen that yellow stuff that's like a board. It's very stiff and maybe, an inch thick, which they use. Well, this is the same kind of material. And the advantage of this is, and each one of those wedges is actually enclosed in a chicken wire. You can't really see it that closely, but
right.
It just keeps all the fiberglass intact over a period of time.
And the interesting thing is that this is on all 6 walls of basically a room. It's 4 walls, ceiling, and floor.
That's right. And the wedges in this particular chamber are 1 meter deep.
So roughly 3 feet.
Right. And the cutoff frequency technically of this chamber is 80 hertz. And the cutoff frequency is determined by something that's not anechoic, where some effects of the boundaries start to influence the measurement. And where you see that speaker sitting on the
go back to the previous one there, Chris.
Go back one. Where you see the speaker sitting there, the measurement I take has a correction curve that compensates for where the chamber becomes non-anechoic. And that means that it has, in order to be anechoic, it at all frequencies at which it's anechoic, it must absorb up to no less than 99%.
Wow. Okay.
So if it's 98, then it can't be called anechoic. So we make a correction for that, so that when I do measurements, I can see the performance of the speaker in that location down to 20 hertz. And there are actually 5 microphones in the background. You'll see a slight amount of them. You can just see
sort of barely see them there. Yeah.
And that particular array, I can move up and down, so I can measure it at different heights of the loudspeaker. And then I can also rotate the loudspeaker, so I can look at the speaker in all angles remotely.
Yeah. By the way, I want to mention to everybody before we go on that if you're watching this live on youtube.com/AVS forum, you can post comments there and I'll see them. And we've got one from someone who calls themselves LSU Tigers on Tiger Bait. My very first home theater setup was a full 5.1 PSB setup, the Image series that probably came out about 20 years ago. The mains were the 5Ts, and they were excellent. No one could touch them at that price. And this is certainly a hallmark of PSB speakers is value, is price performance ratio.
Yeah, and once you do science properly, and the science that we've done at NRC, or that I've been involved in, really headed up by Dr. Floyd Toole, who anyone in the audio community would know his name. And at the time I started going to NRC, which was in 1974, Floyd was sort of starting his research on the relationship between measuring objective measurements that you can do in a controlled environment like an anechoic chamber, and looking at those results and comparing it with listeners' subjective judgments, so that to see if there is some correlation between the two. And of course, PSB has benefited from understanding what's important and what is not important. And when you know that kind of information, you can make good decisions about good value and good things that you can add, and be very conscious of what you're adding and what value subjectively that is adding to it. And, you know, as you get into lower price products, there are certain things you won't trade off, but there are other things that you will.
Right. Exactly. So here, this picture, we're looking at some of the instrumentation. Speaking of measurements.
Yeah, this is the lab outside the anechoic chamber. The door to the chamber is just to the left of this picture. And you can see proudly positioned a PSB monitor sitting up on top. And this is a fairly old picture. The bench is the same, and so is the DOS computer you see on the right-hand side.
They still use a DOS computer?
Yeah, and in fact...
because it's running certain software that probably couldn't run on
well,
stuff.
It's integrated with... you see a little brown rectangular box just above the right-hand side there on the second shelf.
Yeah.
That's a very similar technology to audio precision, in that it's a measurement system that is computer controlled. And this is a Canadian product that was built, you know, back in the when was that? Mid 90s, early 90s. And maybe even before then. And the control of that system and the software, and the software that was written to run this system was written by Floyd's group, and it was written back in the day when there was only DOS. I think this computer has 3.1 on it, Windows 3.1.
Oh man!
Yeah.
If we go to the next slide, I just want to show a quick picture of what we saw before in the anechoic chamber. It had the deep wedges on all sides, ceiling, and floor. This has a solid floor.
Well, let me explain this picture. There actually are two facilities that have anechoic chambers in Ottawa. The one that we showed previous to this was the one I use all the time. But when I want to do really low frequency accurate measurements, I use this chamber, and this chamber has 2-meter wedges. And you can see there's a guy standing way back in the corner. You can see how big this chamber is.
Man, it's huge.
The guy in the corner is 6'2". And yeah, so
this chamber must be 20, 30 feet tall.
Oh yeah. And it has a robotics microphone system that's attached to the ceiling. And you can program in the coordinates and have the microphone, instead of rotating the unit you're measuring, you can put the microphone anywhere in 3 dimensions around the loudspeaker. And the other thing is the floor. The floor is like a sort of granite slabs that are on a framework. And underneath that framework, underneath that framework is like a trampoline of aircraft wire. And so when you remove the floor, the wedges you see on the wall are also below that floor.
It's a removable floor. I got you.
And this particular mode of the anechoic chamber is called the 2-pi mode, as opposed 2-pi meaning half a sphere,
right?
And 4-pi meaning a full sphere. And when you take the floor out, just like you saw in the earlier anechoic chamber picture, where the floor was out, that chamber, the smaller chamber, actually has a floor you can put in as well. And so,
what's the advantage of doing a 2-pi with a floor?
Well, I might want to put a in-wall speaker in the floor and measure what it would be like on a bound.
Of course.
Because that's a 2-pi radiation
Right. An in-wall speaker, of course. Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, this chamber is used for, a lot of other purposes. I've even seen experiments in here where they're put up a blind screen and put subjects in the chamber and put speakers all around and measure their vitals while they send airplanes through the speakers, firing and swooping all over you to see what you're in a controlled experiment, what the sounds and those things, how they affect your emotional and physical responses. So a lot of research goes on here. This particular chamber is in a different location in Ottawa. And I use this chamber to create the data that is required to calibrate the smaller chamber. So what I did was I took a full range speaker and put it in this chamber, did a measurement, and the same day took that speaker to the other chamber, measured it, and looked at the difference. And that difference is the correction curve to make the small chamber give you the same answer when you put the speaker in the right location.
Very good.
Yeah, so that's why I can get low frequency calibrations down to 20 hertz in a smaller chamber.
In a smaller chamber, because you have that correction curve.
As long as I use the same location. As soon as you move locations, that correction doesn't apply because the correction in another location would have to be different.
You mentioned Floyd Toole doing research on the relationship between measurements in an anechoic chamber and listeners, maybe even in a real room. And the next picture we have to show people is the actual listening room. I think it's at NRC, but let's take a look at that. The next photo, Chris, in the slide deck. There it is.
Yeah, that's the famous IEC recommended listening room, which was adapted after all this work that Floyd had, all these papers that Floyd had published on the results of the comparing subjective versus objective measurements of loudspeakers. The IEC electrical conference in Europe adapted this as a recommended listening setup. So this is the IEC standard listening room, which was developed at NRC by Floyd Toole. You'll notice there are some panels on the side walls. What was the reason for those was, you could argue, well, the room has been overtreated. The room was designed to do speaker evaluations with up to 4 listeners. In this case, there were only 3 seats in the room. And the objective was to try and make the transfer function of what the listener heard, the sound that the listener heard, to be, especially at low frequencies, the same in all 3 seating positions. So that the listening area could be expanded by creating these absorbers. And, the back wall, you'll see there's curtains on the back wall behind those lights. And behind that was a membrane absorber, a low frequency membrane absorber, to try and smooth out the room so that all 3 of those listening positions presented the listeners with basically the same transfer function or the same sound.
The problem for me, though, I mean, I understand what they're doing here, but how many consumers at home will have such a room?
They won't. And what this is trying to do is, we know that all rooms are all different. We wanted to make something that was really only listening to the loudspeaker as much as possible. And delineating, because the room that speaker may end up in, some of the good things about the speaker could be swamped or enhanced by the room. But we didn't want to be biased by this particular room, and specifically enabled to do enough statistical data on what listeners' responses would be. To do one person at a time would be very difficult over a period of time.
Yeah.
Well, So maybe people could argue that there's a flaw in this, but the results with the number of years that this practice has been in place shows that definitely it's a very useful tool for evaluating and correlating measurements with subjective responses in a double-blind screen test like this.
Right, right. We have one more picture in the anechoic chamber that I just want to briefly show, which is a lovely photo of you and a speaker in the anechoic chamber. You at a younger age, shall we say.
Yeah, that's a Stratus Silver,
Uh-huh.
which we produced in around the mid-90s. And,
Well,
and that was a beauty shot that was created actually by NRC for a promotional brochure that they were sending out to all the whole industry, the technological industry. And this,
right.
So they came in and did a photo shoot, and yeah, and I guess because of the synchrony was there, or sorry, the synchrony. No, this is a Stratus Silver.
Stratus Silver, yeah.
It obviously was a product I was working on at the time.
Yeah, right, right. We should say, I don't know did we specify what NRC stands for?
It stands for the National Research Council.
And they research all sorts of stuff, not just acoustics.
Well, yeah, it's a think tank that employs about 1,000 PhDs in all of the science, and it's government funded. So we as taxpayers pay for this facility, and it was really originally developed and started in 1916 to help Canadian manufacturers compete worldwide. And so it employs, like I said, about 1,000 PhDs in all of the sciences, medical, standards, acoustics, astrophysics, physics,
climate, probably.
Climate, building research, agriculture.
Sure.
All of those things are under the NRC's mandate. And the main campus is in Ottawa, but there are other campuses in the Midwest as well, doing different research. But and they also do a lot of semiconductor work.
Oh,
some of the greatest breakthroughs in semiconductor technology developed at NRC. Other things like thin film,
transistors, thin film.
Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah. And, one thing I will say is, with NRC, the luxury of me being able as an industry person to be able to get into the bowels of NRC, which is originally was a pure research facility, and pick the brains of all these PhDs.
Oh man, that must have been just awesome.
Yeah. And, at lunchtime, when I was working in the chamber, they had an intercom system where, one of the doctors would be in charge of coffee for that day and would say over the intercom system, like, coffee's ready. And that was a real great time for me to drop what I was doing from M37 and go over to M36 where the coffee room was, and just sit with these PhDs, listen to what they had to say, and
oh man,
and be able to ask questions. And they were all specialists in acoustics, some in straight acoustics and some in psychoacoustics. Like Dr. Edgar Shaw, who was the head of the acoustics division at the time I first started going to NRC. He was actually Floyd's section head, and he did all the mapping of the external ear. If you go to all the textbooks, it's Dr. Edgar Shaw that did all the mapping of how our pinna works and where, at different angles. I remember going in to his lab in M36 where the lunchroom was. He had a lab in there where he had all this white felt all the way around, and you could see a pinna in the middle of a table, and then a source that he had created, a point source he had created, which allowed him to squirt sound at the pinna and measure it at different angles all the way around it. And so he's methodically mapped what all these little things do in your ear to make the sound.
Amazing. And
Yeah.
here you were having coffee breaks with these guys.
Yeah. It was amazing.
Well, we're going to turn now to some of the hallmark speakers that you developed over the last 50 years. But before we do, Laverne Lee Sr. has a question for you, which has to do with subwoofers. We really didn't plan to talk much about subwoofers, but I like to pass on as many questions as I can. And the question is, what is phase and how do I benefit from it? So subwoofers have a phase control.
Well,
and the question is, what's it for? What's it good for?
Well, because the subwoofer isn't physically in the same place as your left and right speaker. Let's take a 2-channel setup for the sake of discussion. You can put the subwoofer between the two left and right speakers, which may not necessarily be the best position relative to where you're going to sit in the room to get good low frequency coupling and maybe a bit better performance. Not necessarily in the middle of the room when you're sitting wherever you're sitting. So one of the beauties of a subwoofer, it allows you some flexibility in where it can be in the room, because at low frequencies below 100 hertz, we as human beings have very difficult time locating where that sound is coming from because of the long wavelengths that 100 and below have. 100 hertz has a 6-foot wavelength. So and because our ears are only 3 feet apart, or 3 feet, only 6 inches apart, a wavelength of 6 feet, the phase difference between the left and right and the intensity is very little difference. So it's hard for us to say where it came from.
Right.
But as the frequencies get higher, that delay and that phase difference between the two ears starts to give us enough information to tell us where the sound is coming from. So we take advantage of that phenomena and make it possible to be a little bit flexible, so we can make the subwoofer couple into the room and work good where you're sitting. And then the satellites can be left and right, in this case, to give you the best stereo image that you're going, so you can get the best of both worlds. And when you put the subwoofer in another location, you've got to keep in mind that the subwoofer and the satellite share some frequencies together where they cross over.
Right.
So at that crossover frequency, you want to make sure that the sound coming from at those frequencies coming from the satellite arrives to you in phase with the sound at those frequencies that are coming from the subwoofer. So because you may move it around, and I can't predict where you're going to put it, so I can't tell you what the phase will be when they're trying to marry the two together. I also, in many cases, don't know the transfer function of the left and right speaker at the low frequency in order to get the phase right, because it's something you have to know in order to adjust the phase. So there are two kinds of phase controls that we've used and other people use. One is just an inversion, and so it goes from 0 in phase to 180 degrees out of phase.
Right. So it's a bipolar switch, just on or off, 0 or 180.
0 or 180. And what I suggest you do is, listen to the subwoofer in your seating position and have someone else switch the switch with music playing. You'll be able to determine which one you prefer. And in many cases, what it'll do is it'll emphasize one frequency and de-emphasize another. So you may be just switching between two evils rather than getting something that's appropriate.
Right.
If you have a variable phase, and there's two kinds of variable phase. One is called an all-pass filter, and the other is delay. So you can delay the entire subwoofer with a control, or you can change the phase that's frequency dependent around the crossover frequency.
Mm.
So in some cases we use digital delay if we're in the digital domain, and in some cases we can use an analog all-pass filter that allows us to just sweep the phase around the frequency where they both share the same frequencies, and try and dial that in more accurately.
And once again, probably one good way to do it is to have you, the owner of the subwoofer, sitting in your seat listening to music and somebody else kind of adjusting that knob until you get something that sounds good.
There is something that it's not perfect, but it's worth trying. And that is literally put the subwoofer in the chair you're going to be sitting in, and then crawl around the room in places where you may end up putting the sub. And listen to this won't necessarily cause the phase between the two to be right, but it will definitely find a good spot that you would like the sound of in the room. So once you find that location, then you can play around with whatever phase capabilities the subwoofer you have. And like I said, it's something that you need to do. You can do empirically. You could also get one of these apps on your phone that can measure some spectrum.
Yep.
Sit in the seat you are in and switch between the two and look at what changes in the room. And it's not hard to discern which one looks better on paper or on a graph. And microphones in cell phones are quite good at low frequencies.
I'm quite amazed at that, actually. Yeah.
Well, so you can trust that the differences you're seeing are giving you good information.
Well, I want to now take a look at some of the speakers in your history, and we're going to get to a question that Beatmaster in the chat room has, which is your preferred speaker driver arrangement. We're going to get to that, Beatmaster, so hang on. What we're looking at here is a nice photo that was taken. I don't know where it was taken, but it's kind of a timeline of the speakers, some of the speakers anyway, that and headphones even, that you have developed over the years.
That's right. The furthest from us is a product called the Beta 2. And
we have a picture. We have a picture of that coming up next.
Well, I'll just walk through them, and then we'll talk about the individual ones.
Okay.
Yeah. The next one is the Passive 2, and then the tall wood one you see is called the Project B2, and that was developed back in 1979, and we launched it in early 1980. And then beside it is the Avante. So all of those three products, or all of those four products, coexisted between 1972 and 1982, about 10 years. And of course, this is just a sampling of the models that we made. We made, other models. One was called the Targa. So yeah, this
is not every speaker you ever made.
No. And then the next one, Tower, beside it, I can't remember. Oh, that's a more recent. That's called the R series. That was called the R50 PSB, and that's the first product that was produced once I joined the Lembrook group of companies, which is the current umbrella company that PSB is under, including NAD and Blue Sound. So there are three brands under the Lembrook umbrella, and that model you see was called the Avante, not the Avante, it was called the PSB 50R. We called it the R series. And then in 91, I developed the Stratus Gold, and you'll see there are actually two of them in this picture. One is done in a walnut finish and another is done in oak. And this was really the start of PSB becoming more of an international offering, or offering products internationally. Beside that is this is a new picture for me. Beside that is a an Imagine Mini.
The little one on the stand.
Yeah, the little one on the stand. And then the one beside it is the Synchrony 1. And then the headphones are beside it. The M4U, in this case, it was the M4U 2s. We're now up to the M4U 8 Mark 2s. And beside it is the Imagine T3. And beside it, the closest speaker is the new Synchrony, we're calling again, the Synchrony T600.
Very good. And let's see, according AVS Forum, actually June at Lenbrook is in the chat room. Hi, June. And she's saying the photo was taken at a studio in Toronto during the filming of the documentary that went live on your YouTube channel a couple of weeks ago. And I have to say, I would strongly recommend that everyone go to that YouTube channel. June, if you can put in the chat the exact address, I'll pass it along, certainly, because I saw it a couple of weeks ago. You guys had a 50th anniversary online event, which I attended. And you also showed the documentary there, I think for the first time to the public. And boy, oh boy, it's wonderful. I mean, it's professionally produced. It's like something you'd watch on Netflix with a whole much more to the history of PSB speakers. You told me offline that you sat and gave something like 9 or 10 hours worth of interviews.
Well, I think actually it went over a period of 2 different sessions. One day was about 4 hours and the other day was 9.
Oh, man.
So, and I lost my voice. In fact, if you listen to the video, you can see in some of towards the end of the video where I'm standing on stage, at least I noticed it, my voice was starting to get a little tired.
Oh, I didn't notice. I actually didn't. And believe me, I would have noticed. My wife is a voice therapist and speech pathologist, and she has taught me to train my ear to vocal problems, and I didn't notice it at all. So I think you're good.
Good. Yeah, that was really a lot of fun, and I'm just so thrilled that we have something that sort of earmarks my career.
Oh yeah, what a testament! What a testament! So I hope, June, when you put the link in the comments here, I will pass them along. Let's see. Okay. Anyway, let's go back and talk about some of the hallmark speakers that you have developed over the years. We've got about 12 minutes left. So let's go to the next picture, which is going to be number 10, I believe. And that will show us your very first speaker.
Yeah, this is the Beta 2, and I won't be too long-winded. I developed this speaker kind of as our original flagship, you could say, because it was unique in that even at the time, it had a servo-controlled feedback loop off the woofer. So this was a servo feedback loudspeaker that had an accelerometer underneath the dust cap of the woofer, which on the back of the speaker inside, you had access to a comparing circuit that took the signal from the preamp, compared it with the signal coming back from the woofer, and made corrections in order to make the woofer. This was not a very tall, it was about a 28-inch tall by 12 inches wide by 12 inches deep size cabinet, but it went flat down to about 20 hertz.
Man.
Well,
this was what, 1972, 1973?
I designed this in 73.
Mm-hmm.
It was, after the first year of starting PSB, this was before I went to NRC. I was able to use a small anechoic chamber that was in the Kitchener-Waterloo area at a company called Unitron Industries, and they made hearing aids. And they had a small anechoic chamber, and they let me use it to do the initial development of this speaker. And I put an ad in one of the local or the Canadian audio scene magazine that was edited by Ernie Welling, and assistant editor was Ian Masters. You probably know Ian Masters.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he called me up after we put an ad for this loudspeaker in the magazine, and this speaker was the reason I got a chance to meet Dr. Floyd Toole, because he was adamant about me meeting Dr. Floyd Toole, who he was working with to do speaker reviews for the magazine. And Floyd set up a thing where he would do the measurements, and then Ian would come up to Ottawa, and that's where all the first listening tests started. And so Ian told me about all this stuff after I met him, and he insisted I meet Dr. Floyd Toole. The arrangements were made, and I never looked back since. Hello?
I'm so sorry. I hit the wrong button.
Oh, okay.
My apologies.
Okay. Where did it cut off?
You were just talking about Ian.
Yeah, well, Ian Masters introduced me to Floyd Toole because we had advertised this speaker in a magazine, and in his magazine, Audio Scene, which was a McLean Hunter publication here in Canada, and arrangements were made, and I drove up to Ottawa to meet Floyd, and we hit it off really well, and never looked back since.
By the way, June put a link in the comments to see that documentary. All you have to do is go to your website, psbspeakers.com/50 years, 50 years.
Yeah, it's a 23-minute documentary.
Right, and it's beautiful. I highly recommend you go check it out. Let's go to the next one.
I will say that there is some overlap in what we're talking about, because my career hasn't changed
since you made the yeah. I get it. Okay, here we have a very tiny picture.
Oh, I didn't realize it was so insignificant. Yeah, this is just a picture of the Avante, and where it's sitting actually is on the top shelf in the lab at NRC in the early days. This is another, I would say, the next flagship that we did. Not very well known because we didn't build it for very long. And we called this the Summit series. And this used Audex drivers from France, a 1-inch Audex tweeter and a 8-inch Beckstream Audex woofer.
And the trapezoidal design of the cabinet, what was that for?
Well, just for looks, really.
Oh, I thought there might be an acoustic reason.
Well, there is some advantage to making walls non-parallel. So I mean, I could argue that there is some benefit to that, but it's probably a fairly low order effect.
Okay, the next one that we have up here is the next photo coming along. Another tiny photo. Sorry about that, everybody.
Actually, I did send you one that was much larger than that.
Oh, well, I just got the small. I put the small one up. Sorry.
Okay. Well,
nope, not that one.
If you go back, sorry about the picture, but this is a model we called, and in that lineup you saw in the first photo that we showed, it's called the Project B2. And this is the first time that I started to orient the tweeter below the driver that it crosses over from.
And this gets back to Beatmaster's question.
Yeah.
Of your preferred driver orientation.
Yeah. And, when I was doing the development of this product, I did start out with the tweeter above, which was sort of the generic way of doing things, and realized that where the two units shared the same frequencies at the crossover point, I looked at it below the speaker, or at the below the 0 degrees axis, looking down on from down on the speaker versus up on the speaker. And I noticed that where they were actually in phase, because the two drivers are not coincident. And since they're not coincident, as you move up and down vertically, you will be changing the path length difference between the voice coil of the woofer versus the voice coil of the tweeter. So the distance is going to change as you move up and down. I wanted the speaker to be as consistent from sitting down to standing up. And when I did the measurements, I realized that it was good from sitting to lying on the floor. So the first thing to do is just switch the tweeter and the woofer, and the lobe will. And the reason the lobe was tilting the way it was is the kind of crossover network that I was using. I was using a acoustic fourth order Linquist Raleigh crossover. And if you go to
which if I'm not mistaken, a fourth order means that the slopes of the crossovers are quite steep.
Yeah, 24 dB per octave. So, and that takes advantage of the fact that, you can cross the tweeter over lower and better match the directivity of the tweeter at its lowest frequency with the directivity of the woofer at its highest frequency. I want those to be the same. And I could talk for hours about why that.
But you found that putting the mid-range or the woofer in the case of a two-way above the tweeter helped in that effort?
Well, if you read all of Siegfried Lindquist's papers about this topic of non-coincident drivers on a baffle, and if you use a fourth order Lindquist, you'll notice if the tweeter is above the woofer, the lobe tilts down. But if you put the tweeter below the woofer, the lobe tilts up. So now, from the seating to the standing position, you're in the in-phase lobe of that combination of drivers.
I guess it makes it worse if you're lying on the floor.
Well, who cares? If you're lying on the floor, you're probably doing something else.
Okay, so the Project B2 was the first one where you put the mid-range or woofer in the case. That was not a two-way. That was a three-way?
On the Project B2? That's a two-way.
Two-way. So the woofer was above the tweeter.
Yeah, that's right. Well, woofer mid-range.
Mid-range, yeah. Woofer mid. Yeah, right. Okay, so the next one.
Yeah, later on we did a series of products we called the MK series and the CS series. And this is a brochure we produced. And those baffles were actually made out of the same material that, and it's called RIM, reaction injection molding. And those whole baffles were a huge tool where we used RIM to produce the part. And RIM is a technology that the automotive industry uses to make the fascia covers for the bumpers. You know, the painted bumpers that are on cars today? Well, that coating or that cover over the main bumper is actually this material. It's called polyurea. And it's got a lot of really good properties. And I did a lot of experimenting with it. So that was the CS series. And we built that for maybe 3 or 4 years.
Moving on to the next one. We have.
And that just shows one of the CS. That's the that's the CS 260 on that rapid injection molded baffle.
Now, doesn't this have the tweeter on top?
This has the tweeter on top, and you can. This particular speaker and all the speakers that do have the tweeter on top use third order Butterworth filters, and the phase is different, but they're not as steep a slope. So
got it.
If I want to get the tweeter to go down really low, I have to use higher order crossovers.
And then the other arrangement. Beatmaster asks, did you use the conventional arrangement on the Imagine series because it's different for home theater?
No, it should be the same. But like I said, the orientation of the driver can work above when the tweeter's above if you use the right
crossover
type.
Okay, let's go to the next. Let's go to the next picture. Here we're in the Alpha.
Yeah, and the Alpha, which really started in 91, that was the first Alpha that we did, and Stereophile called it the Amazing Alpha. And it's been a part of PSB since 91. And
Wow.
there was a model that I developed in about 90, excuse me, a version that I developed in around 99, which we called the Alpha B1. And that product just got discontinued. So that was in 1999. So 23 years
Yeah.
we produced that model. And it was extremely successful. And the whole idea behind it was didn't have a lot of bells and whistles. It was simple. The grill could not be removed to make it cheaper, so we didn't have to make a grill frame and then put cloth on it. We just covered the baffle in cloth.
Mm-hmm.
The back was removable, and it had, you know, good drivers, but we didn't. The cabinet was very simple to make, and so we passed that savings and didn't compromise any performance in a category like this.
Mm-hmm.
It was able to be very competitive with pricing, and that's
So it lasted 23 years.
yeah, that's bore out by the length of time it's, and it went for that 23 years. It went with virtually no changes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I made a small change in the cone material, but other than that, it's basically the same system.
So moving on to the next one, we have.
Yeah, this is just another image of the B1. In fact, this is the B1. The other one was the Alpha AV. So this is the one that we started producing in 99 and produced it right up until recently.
And oh, great. The next one.
Yeah,
The famous audio magazine cover.
Yeah, this was a review in Audio Magazine way back in 91 when PSB first produced the Stratus Gold. And you can see here that the woofer or mid-range driver is above the tweeter. So in the high-end product, I continue to use this configuration with a fourth order Linquist crossover. And in this review, Don Keel, who is doing Audio Magazine's reviews, he's well known in the professional speaker business with Altec Lansing and JBL. And he would do reviews for Audio Magazine back in those days. And he did the review of the Stratus Gold. And he used to do a test, a power test that, you know, he even generated some test signals for other reviewers to use. And it was impulse bursts of sound that were enveloped. So they didn't just like a square, they had envelopes of bursts at different frequencies.
Right.
And he had a Crown macro amplifier, which is capable into 4 ohms of producing 200 volts. And he could take the Crown amplifier and drive it right to clipping without any misbehaving of the loudspeaker using his signals. And if you do the math, 200 volts into 4 ohms is 10,000 watts.
10 kilowatts.
That's right.
Now, that's not sustained. How long were those impulses? Probably only a few milliseconds.
Yeah, this was a test to determine whether the speaker just fell apart with wide dynamics. And the Stratus Gold did not.
Did not. Wow. Okay, moving on to the next picture. We just got a few more to go here that I really want to touch. These are touch marks.
Yeah.
Touch points.
After the Stratus Gold, the Stratus Gold construction technique was designed to make it easy to assemble with parts that were already pre-finished. So the model before that we talked about, the Stratus Gold, had 4 aluminum extrusions on each corner, one on each corner. And they were tongue and grooved into the panels of the sides, and the whole thing fit together like a puzzle. This model, the Synchrony 1, took that to the next level, where the aluminum tongue and grooved into the side panels, but the whole front baffle and the back column that produced the back baffle were aluminum extrusions, so that the whole baffle was aluminum. But I continued to use the technique of putting the mid-range and the tweeter. So you can see here that I've inverted everything. The woofer, the mid-range, and the tweeter are all inverted. And this design is a a new approach that I was taking to designs where this speaker, and I think we have a cutaway of this speaker.
I think the next one, the
Yeah.
next image, we'll see the cut. Oh, no,
Oh.
this is when you were testing.
Yeah, this is my mule cabinet that I was using when I first developed the Synchrony 1. And this is just a photograph through the anechoic chamber with the speaker facing outside the door.
Right. But the next one is the cutaway.
Yeah, and this is the cutaway. Actually, this is a T3, but I can use this to describe the configuration of the Synchrony 1. The Synchrony 1 had, like this one does, it has 3 separate enclosures. Each woofer is in its own enclosure, and each woofer has its own port tube. So it has some advantage in that it stops a standing wave that occurs at frequencies that the woofers produce if the cabinet is all open, because it's proportional to a standing wave in the region of around 100 hertz. So I don't want that standing wave in there. So you subdivide the cabinet, put a port in each cavity, and you get the same result because it's the same volume of air. It's shared by 3 woofers. And the beauty of this is it stops that standing wave. There's another advantage in that each of the woofers crosses over at a different frequency.
I was going to ask you about this. You talked about this in the event that I went to, that not all 3 there are 3 woofers there, but they aren't all operating exactly the same.
Yeah, each woofer produces the low frequencies together. So they all produce the lowest frequency. But the bottom woofer rolls off at about 100 hertz. The middle woofer rolls off at about 250 hertz. And only the top woofer at 500 hertz rolls off, or maybe it's closer to 600 hertz, rolls off to the mid-range driver. And then the mid-range driver rolls off to the tweeter. So at low frequencies, this speaker has a very large surface area, the surface area of all 3 of those woofers. And because you're spreading that low frequency over such a large area, it actually couples into the air better than it would if it was a single source.
Single larger driver.
Single larger source. Even though it was single larger, you wouldn't get one that has a source this size. And so it does couple better into the air in the room. And that is bore out by measurements you do. If you do a prediction of what the transfer function would be, you actually get a couple dB more output out of this speaker at low frequencies because of the way it couples into the air around it. So this is what I call a transitional design. And the Synchrony 1 was the first attempt at that. This is the next version of that, which is the T3. And of course, it's a similar transitional design, just different cabinet construction and another generation of driver development in this series.
Sure. And then finally we get to, I think what we get to next is the current flagship, the Synchrony T600 and B600, right?
That's the next, that is the next step in the product.
So let's go to the next picture. We should see that. Oh, there's nothing there. Go to the next. Oh, there it is. Just took a while to come in.
Yeah, This is 2 models that we've introduced just recently. Yeah, as you can see, the arrangement is very similar. The 3 woofers in their independent enclosures, the mid-range on top, and then the tweeter below it. And the bookshelf, you can see that the woofer / mid-range driver is above the tweeter in that case.
Right.
So I'm using 4th order acoustic linguists on these to cross them over. And so I'm getting lots of good directivity because I can cross the tweeter over at 2 kilohertz and get lots, and the mid-range driver and the 5 1/4 inch woofer in the bookshelf, the 6.5 inch woofer in the bookshelf is quite capable of good dispersion at the crossover frequency. And that's one of the main objectives for trying to get the tweeter go down as low, but still handle a lot of power as a system. And a way to do that is to use 4th order acoustic filters.
Right.
What I mean by acoustic filters is you can put the topology of a 4th order filter in series with, or put it in front of the loudspeaker, but the speaker also is a filter. So
Right.
I create filters based on using optimization, and I set what's called a target function. And then I develop the topology in conjunction with the frequency response and the filtering that the woofer itself has to come up with the filter that I need to give me that acoustic transfer function.
Mm-hmm.
And here's just an example of a cutaway of the T600.
Mm-hmm.
And
And
you'll
the
notice,
next one shows another one with even more cutaway or exploded view.
yeah, so this just shows some of the components, the grill, and then this is an aluminum diamond cut baffle, highly machined, that covers all the screws and things on the baffle, and it's actually on rubber isolators that decouple it from the front baffle,
Mm.
so that all the driver frames and all the stuff on the baffle is somewhat isolated by this aluminum plate that goes on the front of the whole speaker.
And isolation is critical, and you also deal with that in isolating the speaker from the floor. The next slide shows the ISO feet
Yeah,
that are kind of interesting.
yeah, I'm good friends with Dave Morrison, who's the founder of ISO Acoustics, and he and I have been talking for years about doing some collaboration. So this is the first collaboration that Dave and I have done on implementing his technology into some of our designs. So when you buy these speakers, you get the ISO feet along with it. The bookshelf also has an ISO foot, which you didn't probably see because the images were kind of small, but also it has a special ISO foot that was developed to be embedded in the bottom of the loudspeaker, and it just protrudes about 1/4 of an inch, so that when you set it on your stand, it actually gets isolated from the stand.
And this isolation is critical to keep the vibrations within the speaker itself and not transfer them to the floor or the stand, right?
Well, it helps to prevent reflections that occur when you're coupled. It 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 sort of damps but adds mass to the speaker, even though it's isolated, to help the speaker to be more stable.
Mm-hmm.
And it also is designed to have a orientation of vibration, which helps to stabilize the speaker and produces a nicer sound stage.
Mm.
And otherwise, it's really hard to describe. You have to sort of listen to it.
As with so many things audio.
Well, with things with audio, you got to take care of the major things, and then once you get the major things solved, then you start going into some of the detail.
Mm-hmm.
And every time you fix something and make it sound, and it becomes the norm, the next thing can be much smaller, and people go, "Oh, I can hear through all of that." And that, so as you become more of a listener, you actually become someone who magnifies things as time goes on. So that something that where you're introduced to it for the first time is a very low order perceived thing.
Mm-hmm.
Over time, as you refine things more and more, the smaller things become more noticeable.
This reminds me back at the beginning of our conversation, when you were first introduced to music by your father, that led you to become more aware as time went on of the smaller things.
That's right. But over time, those become the things you just hear and listen to intuitively.
Right.
So we as human beings develop that capability over time. When I listen to music, I have to sometimes struggle to listen to the music because I'm sitting there dissecting that violin or that.
I do the same thing when I go to a concert. And I wonder whether, as a musician, do you as a musician, when you're listening to music, do you hear it differently than someone who is not a musician?
Well, I dissect it in real time.
Mm-hmm.
So I play around with what I hear. And I do that with reproduction music, and I do that when I'm listening to live music. Um, it, I don't know how other people perceive it, but I can actually, focus in on different things quite
And
easily.
do you think that impacts your enjoyment of the
Yeah,
music?
yeah.
Or do you sort of get into an analytical space that gets away from the emotional?
Well, actually, part of the enjoyment, if I'm listening to, say, uh, Tchaikovsky violin concerto,
Mm-hmm.
one of my favorites, you know, I'll listen to the soloist, but I'll also stop listening to the soloist and listen to the accompaniment or what else.
Uh-huh. I do the exact same thing.
And
Exactly right.
and maybe the next time I listen to it, I'll listen for other things that are in the recording. So a recording isn't just something you play and okay, done. It's sort of like watching a movie. I do this a lot, where I look for incontinuity.
Yes.
Well, it exists, and I find it quite enjoyable to find incontinuity.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I do that when I listen to music as well. I try and hear the other things that, and I walk around what I'm hearing and listening to. I don't know how else to describe it.
Well, yeah, sure, sure. So we've run over our time a little bit. I'm just going to mention that not only does PSP make speakers, but you also make subwoofers, which we haven't talked about, and headphones.
Right.
And I just want to take one quick moment to talk about headphones. I've heard these headphones, the M4U uh, two, I believe, or one,
This
or
is
I also listened to the M4U 8.
yeah. This is the M4U8 you're showing right now,
Right.
and
Wonderful, wonderful sounding headphones.
and part of the research that I had the luxury of being involved in at NRC was a project that we did called the Athena Project, which was trying to see what the perfect transfer function of sound reproduction in a room needs to be if you use a speaker whose anechoic response is flat. And this project came up with a target function for how you EQ a loudspeaker in a room to make it, for listeners, the most pleasant balance of sound.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I applied the results of that to the headphones response. And we call this feature room feel,
Mm-hmm.
which is basically when you listen to music, most people listen to music that was recorded to be played back on loudspeakers in a room.
Mm-hmm.
And when the mastering guy is doing his final mix and all that sort of stuff, he's listening to it and anticipating that what he's doing is going to be played back on a pair of speakers in a room.
In fact, he's listening to it on a pair of speakers
In
in
a,
a
in a
room.
room.
Yeah.
Right. So all of those judgments. But if you put headphones on, there is no room.
Right.
And a direct radiating loudspeaker doesn't radiate all the frequencies the same. At low frequencies, it's omnidirectional, and at high frequencies, it's more directional.
Mm-hmm.
So that the sound power that the speaker is putting out, which is part of what you hear when you're in a room, you don't hear just the direct sound. You hear the direct sound, early reflections, and you hear reverberant sound where it rattles around the room for a while before it gets to you.
Right.
And all of that sound that you get from a speaker in a room is the sonic fingerprint of that speaker
In that room.
And or in any room. It will be different, but there will always be a contribution of this omnidirectional at low frequencies versus being more directional at high frequencies. So the sound power is not flat in a room. If you have a flat direct radiating loudspeaker on axis, it will have a tilt so that at low frequencies there's more energy than at high frequencies.
Mm-hmm.
I put that transfer function into the headphone because I know you're not listening to it in a room.
Right. So you're simulating a room essentially in the speakers, in the headphones.
In some respects,
Mm-hmm.
with respect to the spectral balance that you hear in the room.
Yeah.
It won't give you out of head experience because it's called room feel. It's more slated towards the spectral balance that you would hear with that music when played on a speaker in a room. It should sound the same on headphones.
Right. So we have these over-ear headphones. You also have the M4U4 in-ears.
Yeah, this is a model we developed quite a number of years ago, and it's just a passive, and it was the very first in-ear that I was able to apply the room field transfer function. And it was kind of an interesting design because it has several cavities inside to create the acoustics that I needed for an in-ear to mimic the transfer function of room field.
Mm-hmm.
I worked a long time on that.
Mm.
It's actually a dual driver. It has a dynamic driver and a balanced armature driver for the high frequencies.
Mm-hmm. Well, I haven't heard these yet, but I'm really looking forward to trying them out because I love the over ears. They were just wonderful.
Yeah.
And finally, we have this picture. Tell us this last photo.
Well, this is Kemar, a very famous torso measurement tool for mostly can be used for doing any kind of acoustic or ear work. Not necessary when it comes to measuring a headphone, because what it's useful for is doing measurements of what it would be like to measure a sound in an environment. But I used this initially. This is actually the torso that Edgar Shaw used to do his research on the pinna. So,
right.
Yeah, this is a piece of test equipment that is available at NRC, and this is the first test setup I used to develop the very first M4U2 that we did. That was our first over-ear headphone.
Mm-hmm.
And what you see here is just setting up and calibrating Kemar to give me calibration for the SPL. So there's a speaker there producing a sound. There's a microphone near the head, and I can monitor the SPL of the ears so that I can get proper calibration. Mm-hmm. And the reason we do it in the anechoic chamber is that we want good signal to noise. We don't want a lot of noise in the background,
right,
to do these measurements.
Right, exactly.
It doesn't really require an anechoic chamber to do these measurements. It just requires a quiet room. In fact, the room I'm in right now is a room I've set up since COVID to do my headphone tests. The test setup is right behind me here.
Mm.
In fact, here is the.
Chris, can you go full screen there on Paul? There you go.
So here is the ear and cheek measurement system. There's a pinna, which is removable, and I can put different size pinnas on it.
Uh-huh.
And this is a clamp, and inside here is a canal that mimics the response of a human ear canal.
Ear canal. Wow. Boy, talk about work at home.
Well, I've been working at home since COVID.
As have we all.
I go in the office from time to time to do a few things, pick up things, and come back. But I've been able to do a lot of work. And of course, that NRC is where I do a lot of the work. And I still go to NRC. It's about a 4-hour drive from my home.
Oh.
In fact, I was there last Tuesday and Wednesday.
Oh, yeah.
I spent time in the chamber.
Well, I got to tell you, it's been a fascinating conversation. And I'm so happy to congratulate you on your 50th anniversary of PSB Speakers, and so glad to share with our audience the level of science and musicality that goes into all PSB products. It's really inspiring, and I have valued our friendship over many years now. And I thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for being part of our industry. You do a good job.
Thank you.
And I was just going to say, I really enjoy doing these things, and I just invite everyone to have a glance at the documentary.
Please, by all means, go to psbspeakers.com/50 years, and that's 50 years, to check out this documentary. 23 minutes, very well spent, to hear a lot of people, including Paul, talk about this remarkable career that you've had. I'm sure you'll enjoy it greatly.
Well, it's not a career I've necessarily had. I'm still having it.
Well, yes. Let us not presume that it's done. I mean,
No, it's not done at all.
we've got plenty more to expect out of Paul Barton. That's for
Yeah.
sure.
Well, there's a lot there's a lot going on right now. Just
stay tuned.
Keep your ears to the ground.
That's right. Paul, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Once again, happy 50th anniversary. And thank you all for watching. And I look forward to seeing you next time on AVS Forum Tech Talk with Scott Wilkinson. Until then, geek out.